This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, lecture number 10, on the book of Mark, the Son of Man and the Messianic Secret. All right, welcome back. Last time we were discussing, we finally broke into the book of Mark. It was portraying Jesus Christ as the amazing servant of the Lord. And we had basically focused on Mark and the person of Mark and kind of his background as a young person, his relationship with Barnabas, his older cousin, going out on the first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas and then quitting, and the rift between Paul and John Mark that actually broke up the relationship of Barnabas and Paul. And then at the end of his life, though, being reunited with Peter in Rome, and Peter seeing Mark as his son, quote, son, spiritual son, and then also connecting up in 2 Timothy 4:11 with Paul at the end of his life, realizing and saying, I want Mark back, he's profitable for me in the ministry. Just the reconciliation after the big split with that at the end of John Mark's life. So, at the end of Paul's life. What I'd like to do now is just look at some just general things in terms of internal evidences. If as Papias says, John Mark is writing as a translator, as interpreter of Peter, and writing Peter's story, in one sense, the gospel, it's interesting. The following things I think are interesting. In the book of Mark, certain things about Peter are omitted. And one of those things is the walking on water. Matthew has, when Jesus walks on water, it's in Matthew chapter 14, Peter gets out of the boat and walks to Jesus as well. And that's a unique thing. The rest of the disciples are staying in the boat. Peter gets out. That story about walking in the water is not found in the book of Mark. And if this is Peter's story, this is kind of interesting. The keys of the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 16, who do people say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. And the keys of the kingdom, Peter gets kind of the keys of the kingdom. That story is not mentioned at all in the book of Mark. The temple tax, Matthew chapter 17 mentions this temple tax. Does your master pay the temple tax? Peter says, of course he does. He goes to Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, you pay the temple tax. Jesus says, hey, go get a fish hook, go down and catch a fish. When you pull up the fish, you're going to find a coin. That coin is to pay for basically for Jesus and Peter alone. Not the other 11, just Peter and Jesus alone. And so that's the temple tax. That's, again, Peter is in a unique kind of position there with Jesus. None of those stories where Peter is the hero and has shown a unique relationship with Jesus, none of those stories are in the book of Mark. On the other hand, what is there is the three bungles of Peter. When Peter botches it up, basically you get just actually in the same type of chapter where Jesus says, thou art Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church. The same chapter, a little bit later, Jesus is telling him he's going to suffer and he's going to die. Peter then rebukes Jesus and says, Jesus, you're not going to suffer and die. You're the Messiah. And Jesus turns to Peter and says, get thee behind me, Satan. And that passage then is found in the book of Mark. Transfiguration, same thing. Peter, James, and John go with Jesus up on the Mount of Transfiguration. Moses and Elijah show there, and Jesus is dazzling white, and he's transfigured in front of them. And then Peter, as always talking, Peter says, let's make 3 Sukkots, let's make 3 booths or huts, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for you. And then all of a sudden his voice from heaven comes down and says, wait a minute. Then Moses and Elijah, no, this is my son. And it's kind of like has his heavenly voice set him straight. And so that's the transfiguration. Again, that is found in the book of Mark. The denials of Peter, when the cock crows, and Peter denies the Lord 3 times. And the cock crows, and Peter is denying the Lord from these servant girls who are saying, you're from Galilee, you know this guy. Peter swears he doesn't know Jesus, denies, and then Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. So these 3 things are in the book of Mark. It's kind of funny, though, I think for a lot of us, usually when you make a mistake and you botch something up, you remember that a lot better than when you did something good. And so it just seems like, the negatives oftentimes, I can be doing, student reviews, and you get wonderful student reviews and things. You get one bad one where the person flames you, and basically you remember the one flaming one over all the 100 that, enjoyed the class. So it's just kind of the way we are. So Peter says that. Now, here's Peter's comment, and I think this is interesting, what comes up here in terms of this statement in chapter 7. And let me just read it here from the text itself. Chapter 7, verse 19. Mark chapter 7, verse 19. And this seems to be, and I should just explain a little bit, when Peter, in the book of Acts, Peter's going to have a vision where these animals are going to come down, and there's unclean animals there. And basically the heavenly voice or whatever is going to say, Peter, get up and eat these unclean animals. And Peter's going to object to this, saying, hey, man, these lips are kosher, man. I've never touched anything that's unclean. And so Peter really objects to the eating of unclean animals. And then finally the voice says, no, Peter, you don't call unclean what I've called clean. And basically this had to do with working with the Gentiles. And did the Gentiles have to eat kosher? And did the Gentiles have to be circumcised? And so Paul and Peter and others in the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 there will be working on this notion about whether the Gentiles have to eat kosher and whether they have to be circumcised. And they decide, no, they don't have to eat circumcised. They don't have to eat kosher and they don't have to be circumcised. And so you get this statement in Mark, which seems to be like a little insertion from Peter. It says, after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull, he asked? Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out through his body. And then in brackets you read, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. And bracket. And so that seems to be something that Peter would have picked up, given this heavenly vision that he had in the book of Acts and then coming up to the Jerusalem Council. So we're just saying that seems to be a statement type of thing that Peter would have picked up on from Acts chapter 10 and 11. What I like about this is the scriptural honesty and integrity and candor of the Scripture. In a lot of other books in ancient Near Eastern documents, the person who's recorded, the great king, is recorded as this wonderful person who does all these wonderful things, and this legendary hero is portrayed almost with no faults. Whereas we see in Scripture, here's Peter, one of the biggest apostles, Peter, James, and John being the closest to Jesus, and in several points, Peter being the closest in things, although there's some debate with John and things, but the scriptural honesty that all the apostles, all these are the 12 guys that are going to found the church, that are going to sit on 12 thrones judging the tribes of Israel, all of 12 of them have problems. And so the Bible points that out, basically. And the point, I think, is to get away from human beings to say, we as human beings all have problems. And the Bible is historically accurate. In other words, the Bible is not giving us a snow job. It's not giving us a legendary tale of this great hero. But it's telling us this hero has warts just like all of us. And so it points those out. And so I think that points to the historicity of these documents, that they're not crafted to make somebody look good or whatever.